got intrigued with personality in adulthood and aging, and developed a more, not the only one, but a more explicitly research-based scale than a lot of the earlier research had been based on. One of the many measurement problems that contributed to the mass confusion around what personality was that a lot of the personality measures were actually more clinically oriented measures. So they were actually designed to diagnose either clinical disorders and or personality disorders, partly because of these early roots in psychotherapy theories. And so in the latter part of the 20th century, you get this kind of shift to factory analytic approaches to thinking about personality. And Costa and McCrae started looking at a particular scale that's survived, and the main thing anymore that's used in gerontology research and in a lot of other research in personality as well, the NEO, and started looking at stability of the NEO across multiple years and then across decades, and started finding stability correlations on the order of 0.5 to 0.7 across decades, which was, until they found it, nobody would have believed it. I mean, nobody was finding correlations on personality measures, earlier forms of personality measures, above like 0.2, 0.3.
What's the NEO?
Hang on a few minutes.
Oh, okay. Because I asked Sophia, I thought maybe I was clueless. I know I'm clueless, but
right.
I'm not the only one.
We will get there very shortly.
To insult you, right? I don't know.
In these kind of early phases, they were focused primarily on 3 dimensions of personality, which were neuroticism, extroversion, and openness, hence the NEO. Going along a somewhat parallel track, and it kind of culminating in a consensus conference at the NIH in somewhere around late 80s, early 90s. This had been kind of foreshadowed by some literature reviews where people were trying to say, how many personality factors are there, and what are we all talking about here? Another issue that was killing the field was that there were lots of different measures. Lots of people were doing factor analysis to try to find underlying latent variables that would give you a smaller set of personality trait measures that might lend some clarity to this morass of smaller measures. But even among the factor analytic people, they were all giving their latent variables different names. And so there was no consistency of names. People were arguing about whether clearly similar constructs were in fact the same constructs, or whether they were different enough that people were actually looking at different things. It's about as confusing as what several of you are looking like you're thinking right now. And so NIH basically put out this call to all the personality researchers that they've been funding and said, come to Bethesda, we'll lock you in a room for a few days, and you guys either sort this mess out or we're not funding you anymore. And what came out of that was the big 5 personality factors that you see in the readings that you have for today. And one of the ways this feeds back into Costa and McCrae's work is, until this point, they have almost entirely been talking about neuroticism, extroversion, and openness, and then they add conscientiousness and agreeableness to join the Big 5 club. And then they also find that the others are stable, but stable in this way, in the correlational stability way, which I think they've lightened up a little bit in the last few years, but you know, they staked all of their early fame and their writings from the early 80s up until at least a few years ago on this idea of personality stability, at least from about age 30 up to 60, maybe 70 something, a little mushy on the high end. And they were very invested in arguing that, first they didn't talk about mean level stability or change. Then they talked about, well, maybe there's some mean level change, but it's not very big, so it's not very important. And then that was kind of the dogma for the field for a while. And then, as you see in some of the papers for today, and we'll be talking about some more in coming slides, it starts to look like it's a bit bigger. There was a paper I was using about a decade or so ago in the class from Costa and McRae, where they summarized towards the end that the accumulated change, mean level change from age 30 to age 60 or 70 was only on the order of about half a standard deviation or so, or maybe up to a standard deviation. And they were saying that wasn't very much, whereas anybody else in psychology and the social sciences would consider a half a standard deviation to be a whopping big change. So they're really trying to minimize the effects. We're talking about 0.5 effect size or something, as opposed to 0.2 being more typical of what people find. So they were really kind of locked into this. And they carried a lot of the field with them, partly because Costa especially, if you ever get a chance to see him at a Jura meeting, you should go hear him talk, because he's one of the more flamboyant and aggressive arguers in the field of gerontology. Most gerontologists are a little kind of low-key and calm when they talk, and Costa is more like a prosecuting attorney. And I think he carried the field. Partly they carried it because they were doing almost all the work for the first decade or so. But they also, I think, he carried it for another decade or so, just out of force of personality. This was interesting. So, if you start with the idea that personality is just ways that people differ from one another that don't have anything to do with intelligence, you can have a really huge number of traits. And there are people who are interested in particular, smaller traits of the big five, who do that kind of work, and it can be important, interesting kind of work in its own right. But certainly one of the contributions of factor analysis in this field was looking for organizing latent variables that underlie and explain this potentially large array of traits. And so you have a very strong factor analytic tradition in personality research. And some people would kind of describe it this way, that the way your starting point is that you just try to collect as many ways as possible of how people describe one another. And you throw all those descriptors, whether they're like, items that people rate, or in some cases people would advocate for just, lots of adjectives that you would say, here's a whole bunch of adjectives, how do you describe this person, this range of adjectives. And you just throw those into your factor analysis machine, and you see what comes out the other end. Actually, surprisingly, what comes out the other end has tended to be fairly consistent, especially with regard to the first two of these. Going back to Hans Eysenck, which is at least mid-20th century, if not a bit earlier, you've got to focus on neuroticism and extroversion. Certainly factors that have been, I think, make intuitive sense to a lot of people, and also factors that have roots in early